So normally the extended homily would be on the third Sunday of the month, but we were on retreat last week, a whole bunch of us from COJ. So today will be the extended question-answer discussion homily. And I've stitched together passages from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 13, and then just one statement from Paul's very famous letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 13. So here's how it goes. The disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" He replied, "So that seeing they do not see or comprehend, hearing they do not hear or understand." Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. And from 1 Corinthians 13, there are three things that last: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. Words inspired by God. All kids are fascinated by stories. And it doesn't matter how often you tell them the same story, they're still fascinated. And even if you're reading a story for them and you miss a word, they'll correct you. But they're still fascinated by the story. Because they have this extraordinary ability to hear a story multiple times, but to grok it at deeper and deeper levels. Most of us adults, if we hear something for the second or third time, we tune out. Because the only way we hear stories is intellectually. We're trying to grok it at a mind level. Kids are relating to stories at much, much deeper levels. Not just even at a heart level, but at a soul level. And so I was fascinated by stories as a child, and I had the good fortune to grow up in a family where the local shanachie, in Ireland, every village had its storyteller. And the local shanachie, the storyteller, was my grandfather, Daddy Jim. So I get to hear all these great Irish epics, going back even to pre-Celtic times of the Tuatha De Danann and Fionn McCool and Cuchulainn and Niamh of the Golden Hair. So I heard these as a little child growing up. And I realized that they transported me through time and through space. So I had a fascination with stories, so much so that in the summer holidays between my junior year in high school and my senior year in high school, I spent 3 months in a little village in West Cork called Chulea. And it's one of the places on the west coast of Ireland where Gaelic or Irish is still the mother tongue. And because this was 1963, at that stage, emigration was a huge issue in Ireland. So many of these villages had almost no young people, but a lot of elderly men and women, often living alone. And so I was a child in the village. At that stage, I'm 15 or 16 years of age. And I spent the entire 3 months just visiting from house to house, visiting with an old man or an old woman. And I wanted to hear the mythology, and I wanted to hear the proverbs. And I very quickly came to the conclusion that stories are the archived wisdom of a culture. And proverbs are the one-liner, bumper stickers, distillation of that wisdom. I remember on one occasion, an old man saying to me, he said, if Christianity had never come to Ireland, we could live according to our proverbs. And he was absolutely right. Because embedded in every culture, in the folklore or the mythology or the proverbs, is the revelation of God to that particular culture. So if you don't need, missionaries in a sense to teach you about the Word of God, if you're plugged into your own folklore, if you're plugged into your own mythology, if you're plugged into your own parables, you have everything you need in order to lead a deep, spiritual, meaningful life. I went on to the seminary, and during my seminary studies, I had the good fortune of encountering a man called Seamus O'Delairga, who was in his late 80s when I met him. And in the mid-1920s, Seamus O'Delairga had founded the Irish Folklore Commission. And he was using the primary school kids of Ireland to go out home and to collect stories from their grandparents and to write them down. And when the phonograph was invented sometime in the 30s, he sent people around with the phonograph to record the voices of these storytellers. And the result is that Ireland has the greatest compendium of folklore of any culture in the world. They collected over 1.5 million manuscript pages of folklore in the period about 20 or 25 years. So I had the privilege of interacting with Seamus when I was in the seminary. And then at age 26, I got to Africa. And over the course of 14 years, I get to live with the Kipsigis people and learn their mythology and proverbs. I get to learn to live with the Nandi people and learn their mythology and proverbs. And then finally, I get to live with the Togan people and their mythology and their proverbs. And more and more and more, I was convinced, now I know for certain, that if you know the mythology of a culture, if you know their proverbs, you understand the core essence of them. It's their archived wisdom. And the missionary really is basically a Gnostic intermediary, as Carl Jung defined it. A Gnostic intermediary is somebody who is well-versed in one or two or more languages or mythologies so that she can cross-fertilize them to the mutual edification. And so that the real function of the missionary is not to be a crusader to impose a new myth, or a new story on the old culture. It is to share stories so that a synthesis may emerge in this conversation. Now that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. Firstly, I'm going to talk about Jesus, the master storyteller. And then I want to look at some foundation myths of our culture. I want to look at faith, hope, and love, because these are basically just 3 forms of storytelling. And then I'm going to look at myth understanding. And I don't have a lisp. I'm not saying misunderstanding, I'm saying myth understanding. How do we really understand myth? And then finally, believing is seeing, the ubiquity of faith. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, Jesus as a master storyteller. Matthew chapter 13 is one of my favorite passages in the scripture, because in 2 locations in this one chapter, he answers the question, why are you talking in parables? So the first time, it's the disciples that ask him. They say, we notice that every time you're asked a question, you respond with the story. Why are you using stories? When somebody asks you, who is my neighbor? Why don't you give a biblical answer or a theological answer, or an intellectual answer? Why? What's the story? What's with all these parables? And he said the first time, he says, I speak in parables so that seeing they may see, but not comprehend. Hearing they may hear, but not understand. Now, why would a storyteller want to say something that people can see, but not understand, or hear, but not comprehend? Because he's saying there are various kinds of people in the audience. And there are some people, and they're just understanding this at an intellectual level. The only part of them that's meeting the story is their intellect, and they're trying to, interpret it literally. And then there are other people, and they're trying to meet the story at an emotional level. And then finally, there are people who are trying to understand it at a soul level. So the guys who are just operating from here, they're not going to get it. They're not going to see it, even though they can hear it, they're not going to comprehend it. So I want to try to wake up people so that they're listening to the Word of God at a far, far deeper level. Later on, he's asked by the crowd themselves, why are you still talking in parables? We challenge you on this. We want to hear, some really real teaching. Why always with the stories? And the second time he says, I speak in parables so that I may reveal things which have been hidden since the foundation of the world. So he seems to be intimating that there are some truths which are so deep that the only way they can be articulated is in story form or in some kind of art form. You can dance it, you can sing it, you can tell stories about it, but you can't, you can't enunciate it in theological or scientific or philosophical language. And that struck me this morning, actually, as I was driving down here from home. The realization that there are parts of us that can only be uncovered, parts which have been hidden since the foundation of the world, that can only be uncovered by a particular state of consciousness. I remember listening to Brian Swim, a cosmologist, some years and years and years ago. I was in my car listening to a podcast, and he made this one statement that just rocked me. And typically, if I'm listening to a podcast, if I hear something that really interesting, I'll stop it, and then I'll think about it and say, okay, is there a homily in that? And then continue with that. So he made this statement. He said, 1 billion years ago, there was no color on planet Earth. I said, hold this. What? Brian, are you telling me that 1 billion years ago, the sky wasn't blue, and grass wasn't green, and daffodils weren't yellow? I put it back on again. He says, 1 billion years ago, there was no color on planet Earth. Because 1 billion years ago, the eye had not yet been invented. The eye was invented 545 million years ago by a tiny little insect called the trilobite. It was the first eye on planet Earth. And so there was no mechanism to infer light from the electromagnetic spectrum or to infer color from the electromagnetic spectrum. So in the absence of a suitable witnessing consciousness, nature is not free to reveal particular aspects of itself. And that's what he was talking about. I've come so that I may reveal things which have been hidden since the foundation of the world. In other words, you're going to need a new kind of witnessing consciousness to grok what I'm telling you. That's why I'm using stories. And just about 2 weeks ago, I was listening to another podcast, and this was a scientist from JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the guys who create the rovers that they landed on Mars to investigate Mars. And he's talking about the International Space Station. And the interview says to him, have there been any medical experiments done in space? He said, actually, there have. There have been medical experiments done in zero gravity. And what they discovered was that some parts of our junk DNA get activated in zero gravity. Now, this said two things to me. Firstly, I've never believed forever that there is any such thing as junk DNA. Nature never creates anything which is redundant. So it's just a measure of our stupidity as biologists that we couldn't figure out what was the purpose of a whole bunch of DNA. Now, some of it gets activated in zero gravity conditions. So what does that tell me? It tells me, firstly, there is no such thing as junk DNA. And it tells me, secondly, that it takes a particular environment to trigger particular parts of consciousness. And it's fascinating to me that that part could only get triggered in outer space, which tells me that we're extraterrestrial entities ourselves. Either we've come from outer space, and we know that's true because all of our physical stuff is stardust, or else we were planted here, or we were genetically modified here by some form of extraterrestrials, so that some of our DNA can only be activated when we become a space-faring tribe again. So here's what Jesus is talking about there. I speak in parables so that I may reveal things which have been hidden since the foundation of the world. So in other words, there are some truths which are so deep that until you develop the appropriate kind of witnessing consciousness, you won't be able to understand it. No matter how many times you see it, you'll just gloss straight over you. So what is that space? It's not the mind, and it's not even the heart. It's the soul. And if we're not accessing the soul as we're listening to the Christ teachers, we're never going to get it. So they were the reasons that Jesus chose to speak only in story form. My second point is this. St. Paul, very famously, as I appended to the reading today, in 1 Corinthians 13, which is a very famous dissertation on love, what love is, he ends with one statement. It's 1 Corinthians 13, chapter 13, verse 13. And he says, ultimately, there are only three things that last: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. So what are these three great virtues that last, the greatest of which is love? I believe that faith is stories which are based on the brain or the mind. I believe that hope is stories that are based on the heart. And I believe that love is stories that are based on spirit or the soul. So they come from three very different places. Faith emerges from mind stories. Hope emerges from heart stories. And love emerges from soul stories. So what is faith? Faith then, in some sense, is just trust in something which you can't see. And hope is trust in something that has not yet manifested. And love is something that's totally outside of time and outside of space. And we tend to do human activity. Human disciplines fall into one of these three categories very differently. And so, for instance, if you look at the sciences, or you look at philosophy, they're basically faith-based stories. They're stories that are coming out of the mind. If you look at propaganda, or you look at tribal histories, they're basically stories that are coming out of the heart, or out of emotional space. And if you look at mythology, or mystical mythology particularly, these are stories that are coming from the soul or the spirit place. So they're coming from very, very different levels. Now, we can misunderstand these, but they're all based on trust. So you imagine the only reason a child agrees to be born, conceived or born, is because archetypally imprinted on it is the trust that there would be a mother and a breast and warm hands to hold it. It's the only reason a child agrees to incarnation. The only reason a little 2-year-old standing on the hood of her daddy's car is going to jump into empty space is because she trusts that daddy is going to grab her and she'll squeal in delight. And the only reason that you and I and every one of us volunteered for incarnation into this world, which sometimes is this nightmare of illusion, of separation from God and from others and from nature, is that ultimately we realize that this illusion, this nightmare is going to dissolve and there will be unity, consciousness again. So for me, that is faith, hope, and love. They're totally different stories coming from different parts of us, and they all depend in some way or other on the notion of trust. That's my second point. Third point, then, I want to look at myth understanding. People, particularly materialistic scientists, who demonize mythology and who canonize science, understand neither. Typically, this falls on a spectrum where you've got the materialistic scientists who think that mythology is kind of the pre-rational ravings of illiterate cultures. That's the best they can do. They make up these stories because they don't understand really how the world works. And at the end of that spectrum, you have fundamentalist religious people who take these mythologies and they interpret them actually literally. And they're both wrong. You can't interpret a myth literally, and you can't abandon a myth and say it's useless. It's the rantings of a pre-rational society. It's very, very different. Myth is really, really, really deep. Myth is the archived wisdom of the culture. And when you understand myth, when you relate to myth at that level, it makes a totally different understanding available to you. Which brings me to my fourth point. I guarantee you that everything you trust and believe in, you're accepting on faith. Everything. And I'm going to give you some examples. I'll give you examples from pure mathematics, from geometry, from physics, from philosophy, from nature herself, and from religion. All of these are predicated on faith. Pure mathematics is sometimes called the queen of the sciences, and it was my major focus in college. I love pure math. But pure math is based on postulates which cannot be proven. In 1889, a very famous Italian mathematician called Giuseppe Peano, P-E-A-N-O, formulated the 5 axioms of modern mathematics, which, if you accept, you can build this really elegant system of mathematics, number theory and set theory, and has tremendous practical applications, but it's based on postulates that cannot be proven. He couldn't prove them, and no mathematician since then can prove them. So you have to accept, on faith, these 5 postulates, and if you accept them, you can build very, very practical, beautiful mathematical models. Now, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was this hubris in science and in mathematics that finally we were getting to a place where we could establish a system of mathematics and a system of science which wouldn't need any postulates whatsoever. We could build it from the ground up, from zero. And then in 1931 came along this brilliant mathematician, arguably the greatest of the 20th century, a guy called Kurt Gödel, an Austrian mathematician, who came up with the theorems of the incompleteness theorems, which show that no axiomatic system of mathematics can be both complete and consistent. It can be complete but not consistent, or it can be consistent but not complete. It cannot be both. In other words, there has to be at least one predicate or at least one postulate that you have to take on faith in order to build any system. And he showed that it's not just that mathematicians weren't bright enough to figure it out. He demonstrated that it could never be done, ever, by anybody. No axiomatic system of mathematics can be built from scratch. You have to accept some predicate, and then you can build the system. So even pure math is based on an act of faith. Certainly geometry is. 2,200 years before Giuseppe Peano, Euclid founded his brilliant model of geometry, and it was based on what he called the 5 elements. Again, 5 postulates that couldn't be proven. And all of geometry is built on these. Now, the frustrating thing is that some of these postulates are self-evident, but they can't be proven. So, for instance, the postulate that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. That seems to be self-evident. But there has never been a mathematician in 23 centuries who's been able to prove that that's the case. So there are 5 postulates, you call them the 5 elements. And if you accept those, you build this extraordinarily important geometrical models. But you have to take those in faith. You cannot prove them, any of them. So geometry is built on faith. Physics, which many people think is kind of the most important science of all, physics is based on the biggest act of faith ever the human race was asked to make. The most important law in science is karma, the law of cause and effect. A causes B, so B comes after A, and A comes before B. Nothing can happen without a previous cause, and every cause results in a subsequent effect. That's the single most important law of science, except there was a Big Bang. And you have to accept on faith that the Big Bang happened. Nobody knows how it happened, but if you can accept this huge miracle, we can explain all the other miracles to you. This huge act of faith. The interesting thing was, it was a Catholic priest, an astrophysicist, a Belgian astrophysicist, who came up with that theory and the title of the Big Bang. But it cannot be proven. So they try to get around it by saying, well, before the Big Bang, if you say, where did it happen, or what happened, what was there before? They say, no. Time and space were created by the Big Bang. So there's no point in asking what happened before the Big Bang, because there wasn't time before the Big Bang. Or where did it happen? There's no point in asking where it happened, because there wasn't space before the Big Bang. Because the Big Bang created time and space and causation. So stop asking stupid questions. So the biggest act of faith you'll ever be asked is to believe in the Big Bang. It's a total act of faith. You take language, and we presume that, language, when you speak the same language, you're speaking the same language. Nothing be further from the truth. Possibly the greatest linguist of the 20th century was a guy called Ferdinand de Saussure, who was a Swiss linguist. And he showed that spoken language consists of 3 elements. And the 3 elements he called the referent, the signified, and the signifier. So you're walking in the bush in East Africa, and you see this huge creature with a huge long neck. It's 18 feet high, and when it runs, the 2 legs at the same side move in the same direction, unlike any other animal. Typically, the front legs and the back legs come in and out. With this particular one, the ones on the right go, and then the ones on the left go. It's got a real waddle even when it's running. So that's, in some senses, that's the referent. That's the thing in the real world. I know you form some kind of an image. You're seeing this for the very first time ever. And you have a signified. You've got an image in your mind. It's partially visual. You saw it. It's partly olfactory. You smelt it. It's partially auditory. You heard it. So you got this image in your mind. And that he called the signified. And now I'm going to tell Margaret, I come back to the village and say, you won't believe what I just saw. And if I'm speaking Swahili, I say, Twiga. I'm going to give it a name. So I'm going to use signifiers to try to communicate to you the signified that I carry in my head and you don't yet have in your head on the basis of something I saw out there. Now, there's only 3 problems with that. The first problem, philosophy calls the myth of the given. And that's the fallacy that what appears in our minds is actually a one-to-one mapping of what's out there. We have absolutely no idea what's out there. 0. In fact, physicists would like us to believe that the only thing that's out there are electromagnetic waves. And mathematicians would like us to believe that the electromagnetic waves ultimately reduce to Boolean algebra, 0s and 1s. And so basically, there's just 0s and 1s that create the impression of waves that you're going to see as a giraffe. So there is no giraffe out there. There's only 0s and 1s out there. That's the first problem. The second problem now, I'm going to try to communicate that to Margaret. And I'm going to use words. And I'm going to have to presume that Margaret understands the words I'm using in the same way that I'm using them. But I'm not certain. She may hear the word and interpret it very differently from how I intend it. And so I'm going to get a dictionary and say, here's what I mean. When I say, extrapolate, here's what I mean by extrapolate. And then she said, what does extrapolate mean? We go to a dictionary. And the dictionary defines extrapolate. The only problem is, it's using other words to explain the word. So we're using Y word to explain X word. But in order to understand Y word, we're going to have to use Z word to explain Y, to explain X. So we're going round and round and round in circles. So every time we use language, we're making huge act of faith. Firstly, that there is something out there. Secondly, that I captured it inside my mind. And then thirdly, that I communicated it to you in a way in which you understand the same thing that I've in my mind. So it's totally based on faith. Philosophy then is basically about stringing together a whole bunch of words to create axioms. So philosophy is totally based on faith. We have to make up these axioms. And we can actually extrapolate from Gödel's mathematical theory, because Gödel showed that no axiomatic system can be both consistent and complete. And he wasn't just talking about math. Anytime you're faced with axioms, propositions of any kind, philosophical propositions, it cannot be complete and at the same time consistent. And the dumb example I was thinking of this morning, crossing the Golden Gate Bridge. I'm going across this mile-long bridge, and it's painted this dull red. And I'd be thinking, how many guys does it take to paint the Golden Gate Bridge? And they're at it constantly. There's teams constantly, moving along, painting. Now imagine one guy, got the contract to paint the Golden Gate Bridge. How long do you think it'd take him? If you ever really look at it, the girders, the uprights, all these things. One guy with a bucket of red paint trying to paint the Golden Gate Bridge. He'd spend his entire lifetime at it and he would never finish it. But at least it would be consistent. It'd be the same guy doing the same kinds of brush strokes right throughout. So he hires 1,000 guys to help him. And now there's a whole bunch of them doing it together. They can do it a lot faster. But it's not as consistent, because each guy is doing it very, very differently, and he's got a different pot of paint. That's what Gödel was saying. A system could be either consistent, be the same color, but not complete, it'll never get done, or it could be completed, but it won't be consistent. And that's true of language, and that's true of philosophy. We're operating on faith completely. Everything we do, we're operating on faith. And religion, very obviously, is. Up front, it says it right up front. So where science pretends that it's operating from empirical observation and experiment, and where philosophy feels that it's operating through induction and deduction, although they're both based on faith, religion says straight up, we fess up, we're operating in faith. We're going to take a particular book, whether it's the Upanishads of Hinduism, or it's the Bhagavad Gita, or it's, the Holy Quran, or the Tanakh, whatever it is. We're going to believe that this book is the inerrant, revealed Word of God. We're going to make an act of faith up front. And then every other thing we learn has to be consistent with that. If it agrees with that, it's true. If it doesn't agree with it, we reject it. So up front, to admit, we're operating on faith. So the truth is, everything is operating on faith. And so the bottom line is this: all we have is stories. Everything you believe is a story that you chose to put your trust in. Whether you're a scientist, an engineer, a mathematician, a linguist, a psychologist, a farmer, whatever you're doing, everything you believe is a story that you've accepted. And so since it's a story you've accepted, it makes sense to really begin thinking, what kind of stories am I going to accept? Or what level of critical thinking will I exercise? And am I going to respond to life by listening to stories that just come from the mind, based on faith? Am I going to listen to stories that are based on the heart? Because if I do, I'm signing up to be on a roller coaster. Or am I going to believe stories that come from the soul? And if I can manage that, then I'm going to find myself in alignment with who I really am and why I've come. Namaste, brothers. So let's open it up to a discussion.
Okay, so how do you know? So can you give us some clues or hints or tips about how we can only listen to the stories of our soul versus our heart? Versus, the mind, we know we can kind of shut down the ego, so I'm pretty good at that one. But, yeah. Can you distinguish the heart from the soul?
Sure. That's a great question. And so when we listen to stories that come from the mind, they're important. I'm not dishing them. They're important. If we're going to operate in the physical world, we need to know gravity, and electromagnetism. We need to know these things. They allow us to manipulate the external environment of the physical cosmos in which we find ourselves. Heart messages very, very often are some form of propaganda. They're trying to sell us something very often. Soul stories are coming, love stories are coming from the soul. And the simplest way, by their fruits you will know them. Any story that makes you anxious, or afraid, or prejudiced, or xenophobic, is probably coming from the heart space, and is coming from some level of propaganda by some particular group. Now, there are some heart messages that come from the likes of the Jesus and the Buddha figures, and they're going to bring us toward love. So that's why I say that the heart messages are a roller coaster. You're going into the heights and the depths. So very simply, look at the stories that you believe in. And if you're, relaxed and you're loving and there's no anxiety in your life and you're not depressed by what you're listening to, or you're not angry against anybody out there, no matter whether or not you agree or disagree with them, if they're the stories you're listening to, they're love stories and they're coming from your soul. The heart stories, if they're making you anxious and fearful and xenophobic, even though they're coming from a heart space, they're not really bringing you to alignment with who you really are and the purpose for which you came. Sure. Then we get back to Margaret.
So, in a sense, then, we are evaluating the faith stories based on the heart stories and the science and common sense. And an example of not doing that would be some extreme stories of extremists that do bad things.
Yes. Okay.
So they're kind of, we need each.
Yeah, you do. Yeah. We need all three. We need the faith stories, the heart stories, and the soul stories. They all have their function. But when it comes to relationships, when it comes to self-understanding, when it comes to our relationship with nature and our relationship with God, we have to place much more emphasis on the soul stories than just the heart stories or the head stories, although those two are important. And you're absolutely right, Joe. Extremism happens when people using heart stories employ people using head stories to impose their story on a different culture or a different nation. That's when wars break out and genocide happens.
Just one other thing about that. I just finished reading about 5 or 6 books by Sam Harris. Okay. And Sam Harris, kind of a famous atheist, yes, although I don't even think he is, in a sense, because that requires a certain amount of faith.
Yes, exactly. It's a religion.
But he was at Stanford, I think, at 9/11, and that really got him very worried about faith. Mm-hmm. And so maybe he threw out the baby with the bath, because he looped the whole gambit of faiths.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you're absolutely right. So atheism is just a form of religion. It's a belief system that God does not exist. Now, very, very often, the God that atheists are dismissing is a God I don't believe in either. I was telling a story during the retreat. I remember some years ago, a mother brought, a 12-year-old kid to me in my office in Los Altos, and she was really upset that this kid had decided to become an atheist. He didn't believe in God. And so my job was to convince him that God existed. And the mother was sitting down in the office, waiting for me to do my shtick and wave the magic wand. So I'm talking to the kid. We had a great conversation, about 15 or 20 minutes. And at the end of it, I said, you know what? The God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. So the problem is that the God that the atheists reject is the God created by fundamentalism. It's this, this cosmic psychopath that drowned out the whole world in a flood and that mandated genocides. So I don't believe in that God. So what they're rejecting actually is a caricature that I reject as well. But very, very often they have as much faith, and as much fundamentalism in not believing in the God that they're thrown out as others do in the God they're holding on to. So fundamentalist, Islam or fundamentalist Christianity is one end of the spectrum. They're trying to shore up a God-shaped hole in the human psyche, but it was actually a caricature of God in the human psyche. So you're absolutely right, Joe. Yeah. So Margaret was next, and then Bonnie.
I don't understand why Jesus talks to the disciples in things that they're not going to understand. Mm-hmm. Like seeing and you're not going to see, all this business. Why does he do that?
Okay. It's a great question, Margaret. So why does Jesus speak in symbols or in language that he knows the disciples won't comprehend? Because there are levels in his audience. Now, I'm going to kind of extrapolate myself here. I'm a very big believer that Jesus believed in reincarnation and taught reincarnation. There are 2 episodes, one in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 17, the Transfiguration, where after an encounter with Moses and Elijah on the mountain, Jesus says, they ask him, why do the scriptures say that Elijah has to come back before the Messiah appears? And Christ says, he's already come back, and they didn't recognize him. And here, Matthew adds in parentheses, here he was speaking about John the Baptist, And then in John's Gospel, in chapter 9, I believe, there's the story of the man born blind outside the city of Jericho, and he's baking alms. And as they're going out, the disciples say to Jesus, why was this guy born blind? Was it his own sin, or was it the sin of his parents? Now, that question didn't make any sense unless they believed in reincarnation. How could somebody be born blind for their own sins? Did he commit a sin in utero? So they believed in reincarnation, and esoteric Judaism does. So I'm convinced that Jesus is teaching, realizes that his audience are going to have many, many, many opportunities, to wake up, that their souls on various levels of their journey, at various levels of awakening. So firstly, he's going to try to fully wake up those who are quite near the awakening, and they're going to become the people who will spread the message. There are other people, and they're just going to receive this at a heart level or a symbolic level, and there are others who are just going to hear it literally, and he's of no interest to them. Herod was one of those. The only person ever in the scriptures that Jesus refused to exchange a single word with was Herod. He spoke even to Pilate. He spoke to the high priest. They drag him in front of Herod, and everything. Wow, my lucky day has come. I've been hearing about this guy for years. Walk across my swimming pool, turn the water into wine. And Jesus didn't even dignify him with an answer, because Jesus could see this is such a young soul that I'm wasting my time. I've less than 12 hours of life left. I'm not going to waste it talking to somebody who has no interest whatsoever in growing. Refused to talk to him. And so Jesus, as he's addressing an audience, realizes there's people out there, and they're very close to awakening, and they'll get what I'm saying. And there are other people, and they'll hear this at an emotional level, and they're either going to be angry with me, or they're going to be happy with me, but it's an emotional reaction, and then they're going to go home and forget about me. On Good Friday, the same guys that I gave bread to in the desert are going to say, yeah, get him. And they're going to watch him getting crucified. So for them, it was just entertainment. So, they were just meeting him here. And there are other people who are just literally translating what he has to say. And so, for instance, when he says, it's harder for a rich man to get to heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. People say, what the hell? There's no way a camel can get through the eye of a needle. So if I have money in the bank, I can't go to heaven. So there's this literal translation. He says, those guys aren't ready for the message yet. So he's trying to fully waken up those who are quite close to awakening, and then hopefully that when they wake up, they'll do the same thing for the next generation, which is what we're trying to do here. Every one of us is trying to wake up. And I say that our mission is twofold. It is to wake fully to who we are, and then secondly, to be part of the team that creates Christ consciousness in our world, possibly even in our time. And so, but we only manage the Christ consciousness for the globe when there's enough of us who are awake to begin trying to spread the message. So he's just looking at his audience, loving all of them, but realizing some are ready and some are not yet. Bonnie was next, and then Bill, and then Johnny.
So I have just a little question for you. Earlier, you, in answer to another question, you defined the description of what God is, that an atheist, the kind of description of God that you would reject just as they reject. What would be the description of the God that you would accept or that you do accept?
If I were advanced enough, I wouldn't answer that question, Bonnie. I'm serious. Because the truth is, the only language capable of even wrestling with that question is called apophatic language, the neti of Hinduism. It's called apophatic. It means X, God is not X. Y, God is not Y. Z, God is not Z. So there is nothing. Lao Tzu says, those who say don't know, and those who know don't say. So the theologians say, but they don't know who God is, and the mystics know who God is, but they won't try to put it into words, because God is totally ineffable. Any characteristics we attribute to God are made up. They're metaphors at very best. They're metaphors. Even to ascribe being to God is a human category. It is meaningless. To even say God exists, that already, is meaningless. It's ineffable, because God is basically ineffable. So the only way you can experience that ineffability, but you can't articulate it. But the problem is, if you're a teacher like a Jesus figure, then you have to adopt a third kind of language. So the theologians use what's called cataphatic language, the language of describing in lurid detail who God loves and who God punishes and what God had for breakfast, but they've never met the girl. And then there's apophatic language that says, neti, neti, no, God is not that, no, God is not that, no, God is not that. And then there's the language of the teacher, the Jesus figures. They have to try to communicate somehow, take these signified from their minds and from their hearts and from their souls and try to communicate it to the rest of us. So when they do, they realize that the only way you can do that is through story or parable. So if you use anything else, if you use theology or science or philosophy, you're not going to communicate it. You're just talking here, or at best here. And so they have to resort to parable and story. So how would I describe God? If I were a mystic, I would say, I can't.
But can you give like a short description such as a teacher
Yes.
would give?
Yes.
Through parable or whatever. I mean, I know that you are often talking in parable. But
that's all I do. I talk in parable. I kind of do little sidelines into science or whatever, just because I'm dealing with a very educated audience in Palo Alto. But my basic mission is to tell stories.
But you can't, or you won't, give some descriptors, such as you were referring to, which would be like the opposite or something of how the person who thinks they know what an atheist believes would describe God, what they think the atheist believes is God. That was really hard to ask you. So I hope you give me something back.
There's a great Sufi story, Bonnie.
Pardon me?
There's a great Sufi story about a trader who lived on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And every month he'd cross the border with about 30 donkeys. And the border patrol knew he was smuggling. They were totally knew he was smuggling. So they'd look at the saddlebags and they'd lift the donkey's tail and open the donkey's mouth. They could never find anything. Every single month, back and forward with his 30 donkeys. And then about 5 or 6 years later, one of the border patrol had retired, and he met this guy by accident in the marketplace. He says, this is totally off the record. We know you're smuggling stuff. I'm not going to tell anybody. Cross my heart and hope to die. What in God's name were you smuggling? And the guy said, donkeys. So you take one group of donkeys across, selling them, buying some others, bringing them back, raising them, and going back. That's what I'm doing. I'm smuggling donkeys. Bill and then Johnny.
Yeah, Jesus spoke in parables so that he could speak to people at different levels at the same time. We can see that in our own society today. Jonathan Livingston Seagull is a perfect example of that. You can read that book on 3 different levels. My favorite is Groundhog Day. Yes. My favorite movie is Groundhog Day. Yes. Because at a brain level, you can thrill and contemplate what it's like to relive your life every day. Mm-hmm. But at a heart level, you can see that Bill Murray, the character, started out as a bad guy and now transitions and becomes a good guy. And so that's heartwarming. And at your soul level, you can see the movie as a reincarnation story. It's a story of reincarnation. Every day he did something a little bit different, a little bit better, until finally he put it all together. And when he put it all together, he didn't have to come back again. To me, that sounds like what we're living right now. So.
That's brilliant, Bill. You're on for next Sunday, up here. No, I'm saying, that was brilliant. Absolutely, right on, right on. Johnny Hannibal.
Thinking about stories and the fact of you have to figure out yourself as opposed to maybe a brief comment on, that was kind of a closing comment I felt.
Yes. But. Okay, that's absolutely brilliant. And it's interesting when you watch the great teachers. I think 2 of the greatest teachers ever would be Socrates and Jesus Christ. Jesus uses stories and Socrates uses questions. But they're both trying to do the same thing. They're trying to uncover from within the innate wisdom. And wisdom is very different from knowledge. Knowledge is, factoids that you glean through your brain. And wisdom is information that comes from your soul. And the Latin notion of education, the Latin word for education, educatio, literally means in Latin, educatio means to lead out from inside of. So education is not about filling empty vessels with factoids. That's not education. It may be schooling, but it's not education. Real education is rolling back the amnesia that every soul has for the reality of who it is and why it's here. So that's precisely what it is, Johnny. The great storytellers And the great people who ask the great questions are rolling back the amnesia from us so that we can remember who we are and why we came. So Karen first and then Maria.
So I want to think about faith for a minute. There are a lot of books on creativity that some of them even titled A Leap of Faith. Okay, first off, there's a little bit of a disconnect for me that a person could write a book about creativity because I don't quite understand how you do that.
Okay.
But there's that, and so there's a leap of faith.
Yeah.
And then if you read the Kierkegaard will say a leap to faith. And so there's this combination of leaping and faith.
Yes.
So I don't know if you're leaping from faith to something else, that, so it is the beginning stage of things.
Mm-hmm.
So could you say something
That's a great
about
question.
that?
So do we start with faith and go elsewhere, or do we take a leap and then find faith in something else? These three parts, it's like examining the human body. So you've got a cardiovascular system, you've got an endocrine system, you've got a musculoskeletal system, you've got a nervous system. But there's only one organism. So we artificially divide it into all these kind of subsystems. The same thing is true about faith, hope, and love, in a sense. Of course, we have brains. Hey, we're incarnated beings. Of course, we have heart and emotions. We got a limbic system. Of course, we have a soul. That's who he is. All these parts work together. So in some senses, faith, hope, and love are just the subsystems meant to be working together. So to isolate them artificially from each other might be interesting for a kind of a theologian or a kind of a psychologist, but ultimately it's not particularly helpful for the human being who's living their life. The heart is contributing, and the muscles are contributing, and the endocrine system is contributing to all of your experience. So faith, hope, and love are absolutely, if you could imagine a yin-yang with three colors instead of just two colors folded into each other, that's really what these three are. They're all folded into each other. They're all growing from each other. An insight can begin in one place and lead to the other. And it doesn't matter where it begins. As long as it permeates the entire system, then it's fulfilling its function. Yeah. Maria. And then Carmen.
I just wanted to mention that I remember a few years ago you gave a homily where you talked about parables and something similar. And you mentioned that you had a sign on your door when you were practicing as a psychologist that said, "Change your story."
Yeah.
And that's great wisdom. And I remembered that, but it's hard to remember that.
Yeah.
So I feel often I'm passively changing my story, and I was wondering if you can give a few examples or steps on how I can proactively change my story.
Okay. So I'm going to take you back in time, Maria, not to a few years ago to that homily, but to the last 4 days up in Healdsburg. And that's what you were doing for 4 days. In this retreat we did on developing your own personal cosmology, you went through a process where you looked at who God was for you. You looked at how you understood yourself to be. You looked at who was neighbor to you. You looked at the question of what do you mean by life. You looked at the question of what do you mean by evil. And you looked at the question, what do you mean by mission? So they're, in some senses, they're like the breadcrumbs that we follow as we're trying to tweak our cosmologies and kind of grow our understanding of ourselves and our purpose. So just every one of them is going to create a story for you. Look at that story. Is it serving you? Is it centering you? If it is, great. If it's not, tweak it a little bit and create a better one. And that notice I had in my door, change your story, originally it was 4 words, but I had to block out one of them. It was a 4-letter word.
I want to thank you for explaining your parables. Because when you said you can be constant but not complete, and complete but not constant, I was still thinking about it. I couldn't comprehend it. And then when you mentioned the story of the Golden Gate Bridge, it was instantaneous clarity.
Brilliant.
Great.
Brilliant.
Keep up the good work.
I'll keep up the good work as long as you keep giving me flans.
Oh.
Yeah. Good.